Everyone heard the officer shout, but only my wife understood the weight behind his words. "Ma'am, step away from the woman and keep your hands visible." That was the first thing Sarah heard while tying her shoelaces in our front yard. She looked up, eyebrows raised, shoelace still in hand, as two patrol officers approached, hands hovering over their holsters like she was about to rob a bank. She wore old joggers, a hoodie, and a legally holstered firearm strapped to her right hip. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing illegal, nothing threatening, but they didn't see her. Not yet. They only saw the gun. One officer had his hand pressed to his radio, voice clipped with tension. "Suspect is armed. Female. Possible threat. Neighborhood complaint." Sarah stood up slowly, calm, controlled. No panic in her breath, just silence. The second officer's eyes dropped to her waist, and that's when the badge clipped beside. Her belt caught the morning light, and just like that, everything changed. "Chief Bennett?" The officer stammered. "Wait, you're Chief Sarah Bennett?" His voice cracked. The other officer froze mid-call. It was like they had seen a ghost, not because she was dangerous, but because she was their boss. Across the street, still whispering into her phone like she was live-streaming a crime thriller, stood Karen Franklin, the HOA president. Tiny dog under one arm, phone in the other, and a smirk that hadn't yet realized it had expired. She had no clue she'd just dialed 911 on the new chief of police. But Karen never cared about truth, only power. This wasn't a sudden outburst or a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was months in the making, a storm that had been brewing behind HOA newsletters, whispered complaints, and thinly veiled warnings. Karen had turned our quiet cul-de-sac into a theater of petty tyranny, and my wife had become her latest target. It had started with chalk, not graffiti. Just kids drawing flowers and hopscotch squares on the sidewalk. Sarah had smiled at it. "Karen, find us $50, then came the grass. Too long by half an inch." Another $25 holiday lights stayed up past January 3rd. $100, but the thing that drove Karen into a frenzy, the thing that kept her awake at night and sent her spiraling into full-blown authoritarian delusion, was Sarah's sidearm, not waving it, not brandishing it, just wearing it, legally, casually, off-duty. Because in our state, open carry wasn't just legal, it was normal. But Karen didn't see it that way. What she saw wasn't a firearm. She saw a challenge. 2 days before the 911 call, she stormed into our yard like she owned it. Sarah was oiling garden shears. Sunlight spilled through the trees. The moment was peaceful, until Karen broke it. "You're being fined," she snapped. $500 a day for visible weaponry in public." Sarah didn't even blink. "That's not enforceable." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're a police officer. You should know better." "I do," Sarah replied calmly. "And I know HOA regulations don't override state law. I'm well within my rights." Karen scoffed like she'd been insulted. "I expected better from someone in your position. You're supposed to set an example." Sarah looked her dead in the eye and said, "I am. One that respects the law, not invents it." Karen left in a fury, vowing to fix it. And she did, in her own twisted way. The moment Sarah stepped out that morning with her holster, Karen made the call. What she didn't expect was for it to backfire. The officers backed off the moment they realized who she was. One even mumbled an apology mid-sentence. Dispatch said possible threat. HOA president said it was urgent. Sarah nodded. You were just doing your job." Then she turned and walked across the lawn, toward Karen. That's when the smirk finally started to vanish. "You filed a false police report," Sarah said, firm but calm. "That's a felony," Karen stuttered. "I didn't know it was you. You weren't in uniform. I thought—" "That's why you don't report threats without verifying," Sarah said. "You didn't just endanger me. You endangered the officers who responded. You endangered your neighbors." Karen tried to brush it off. It was a misunderstanding, but even she didn't believe that. That evening, the doorbell rang. 6 neighbors stood on the porch with brownies, a pie, and a case of soda. They had seen everything, heard everything, and they weren't on Karen's side. "Whatever she's doing to you, it's wrong," one of them said. "We're with you." It meant something. Maybe more than they realized, because Sarah never asked for admiration. Even after becoming chief, she stayed under the radar. She didn't like attention. But now the spotlight was unavoidable, and Karen doubled down. The very next day, a newsletter hit every mailbox in the neighborhood. Bold letters, passive-aggressive tone. Divisive presence threatens community peace. She accused Sarah, again, of intimidating her. She claimed she was deeply shaken by the encounter, that the stranger with a weapon had made her fear for her safety. She never named Sarah, but she didn't have to. It was clear. It was malicious, and it was a lie. Sarah didn't fire back publicly. She didn't need to. She contacted the city attorney and submitted a formal complaint, complete with her body cam footage, the 911 transcript, and a detailed record of Karen's ongoing harassment. That week, the city council quietly scheduled a closed-door meeting. Inside, Sarah laid out everything: the fake rules, the backdoor fines, the anonymous letters some neighbors had received, warning them not to associate with certain people, all traced back to HOA mailers. One council member said, "I thought the HOA just handled landscaping and streetlights. I didn't know. It had become a regime." But Karen still didn't back down. She held a sudden HOA emergency meeting proposing a new rule: no visible firearms in the neighborhood, for the safety of all residents. She even referenced her own 911 call, but this time the neighborhood pushed back. Greg, a usually quiet man from 3 doors down, stood up and said, "You lied to the police. You endangered our chief. You're lucky we're not voting you out tonight." Even her vice president looked away. Karen's eyes flicked around the room. She could feel it. Power slipping. But Karen wasn't the kind to walk away. She believed she was right. Because if she wasn't, everything she built would crumble. So she pushed harder. She started calling around, looking for dirt. Contacted a local reporter, tried to spin her side of the story. What she didn't know was that the reporter's teenage son had once been pulled from a house fire by Sarah. That call didn't go the way she planned. And through it all, Sarah never flinched. She was calm, steady, professional. But I could see it, the flicker in her eyes, the stillness behind her smile. She wasn't just responding. She was preparing. Not for revenge, for justice. Because Karen hadn't just picked the wrong neighbor to bully. She'd picked the one woman who had built her life on protecting people from exactly this kind of abuse. And she had no idea just how close the reckoning truly was. The neighborhood was buzzing, but not with lawnmowers or gossip, with fear. And finally, with truth. After the 911 call, after the confrontation, after the brownies and soda on our porch, something changed. You could feel it in the air. Like static, attention breaking. Karen wasn't just losing control, she was unraveling. But she hadn't figured it out yet. She still strutted down the sidewalk like she ran the block, still clutched her little dog and sent out passive-aggressive newsletters like they were official government memos. Only now, no one was smiling politely anymore. They were watching her, and she hated it. So she did what people like Karen always do when they start to lose their grip. She tried to rewrite the story. She drafted a glossy, full-color HOA newsletter with a title so dramatic it read like a crime thriller. Restoring Safety and Decency to Our Streets. In it, she told her version of events. How a woman with a visible firearm, never named of course, had approached her aggressively. How she, the concerned citizen, had courageously alerted the authorities. How the neighborhood was becoming unsafe. She called Sarah a divisive presence. Never mind that Sarah was the chief of police. That her weapon was holstered, legal, and untouched. That the only threat that day came from Karen's call, not Sarah's presence. She dropped copies into every mailbox, taped them to doors, slid them under doormats. But this time, the neighborhood didn't fall for it, because someone forwarded that same newsletter, along with a note that simply read, "Is this what you let HOA dues pay for?" directly to the mayor's office. The timing couldn't have been worse for Karen. That very week, Sarah was scheduled to speak at the city's public safety conference. It was meant to be routine, a 15-minute talk about precinct community relations. But Sarah doesn't waste opportunities. She didn't grandstand, didn't dramatize, just walked up to the podium, straightened her notes, and calmly laid out the truth. She showed the 911 transcript, a snippet of body cam footage, even screenshots from the HOA newsletter, still warm from people's mailboxes. And then she did what she always does. She told the truth plainly. This isn't about a disagreement. It's about accountability. A false emergency call doesn't just waste resources. It puts lives at risk. The neighborhood, the officers, even the caller. Then she played the audio clip. The moment Karen's voice hit panic pitch, calling Sarah a suspicious armed woman with unknown intent. The room went cold. Reporters scribbled faster. The mayor leaned forward. A state representative rubbed his temple slowly. "And you're saying," the mayor asked, his voice low, "this call was knowingly made against a law-abiding officer who lives in that neighborhood?" Sarah didn't blink. "Not only that, sir. She knew exactly who I was." That was the crack, the first one. And through it, everything began to leak. The mayor called for an internal city review of HOA policies. The city attorney launched an inquiry into misuse of emergency services. And quietly, behind the scenes, Karen's own board began to fracture. That same night, Sarah got a call from Daniel Wu, the HOA's vice president. He apologized, said he'd been bullied, steamrolled, overruled for a year, said Karen had sent out fines without board votes, made changes to bylaws without meetings, falsified records. Sarah didn't judge him. She simply said, "You know what to do," and he did. The next morning, he submitted a full written statement to the city clerk. It exposed everything. How Karen had turned the HOA into her own personal fiefdom. He included documents, screenshots, even calendar invites from emergency board meetings that had never happened. Karen, of course, wasn't done. She spun it, claimed the whole thing was an attack against her for standing up to authoritarian intimidation. She scheduled a new HOA board meeting. This time the room was packed. No cupcakes, no decorations, just tension. Karen stood at the front and gave a speech. She said Sarah had an agenda, that she was intimidating people into silence, that this wasn't about safety, it was about power. But now, no one was buying it. An older woman, Mrs. Geller, who had lived on the block for 35 years, stood up. "I've seen Sarah help this neighborhood more times than I can count," she said. "She helped my grandson when he locked himself out. She stopped a drunk driver from hitting the Johnson twins last Halloween. And you? All you do is write angry letters and hide behind your little title." Karen tried to cut her off. Another man stood up, newsletter in hand. "You lied to the police and slandered our police chief. That's not safety, that's reckless." Karen's voice cracked. She accused them of staging a mutiny, and that's when the board reminded her, HOA, rules allow for a no-confidence vote if requested by more than 10 residents. Karen sneered. "Fine, vote. Let's see who this neighborhood really supports." The votes were counted right there. For removal. To keep. Abstained. Karen stood silent. Her hands trembled, but she tried to smile. She couldn't. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Sarah got a call from Internal Affairs. At first, the city had chosen not to pursue criminal charges for the false report, but the financial records they had started looking into? That changed everything. $75,000 in HOA. Funds were unaccounted for. Labeled under vague categories like security upgrades and community integrity infrastructure. Turns out Karen had hired a private security firm. No business license, no address, no insurance. A shell. She'd funneled HOA money into it. Possibly her own pocket. The DA's office opened a formal investigation into fraud and abuse of power. Karen, oblivious or in denial, posted a long rambling update in the community forum. Called Sarah a rogue cop. Accused the city of collusion. Compared herself to a whistleblower being hunted by a corrupt regime. One resident replied, "You called 911 on the chief of police for wearing a legal sidearm. Sit down." Another posted a meme of Karen holding a megaphone labeled HOA Hysteria with the caption, "When you realize the person you tried to cancel has a badge." Karen retaliated the only way she knew how, louder. She filed a lawsuit against Sarah. Defamation of character, emotional distress, abuse of power. The irony was so thick, it could have been bottled and sold. Sarah didn't even flinch. She read the court summons with a tired sigh. Then she called her brother Evan, a civil litigation attorney who, after hearing the details, actually laughed. "This lawsuit," he said, "is like a soap opera wrapped in a blog post written in all caps." Sarah gave him the green light. And then she went back to work, because while Karen tried to weaponize fiction, Sarah was out doing the real thing, protecting a city. Evan, meanwhile, began to prepare something beautiful, something precise. A legal counter so sharp it would leave Karen bleeding paper cuts. The community saw it all unfold. And they didn't stay quiet. The new HOA leadership created a public transparency portal. Every vote, every decision, every expense posted online. It was a declaration. The era of backroom rule books was over, but not everyone accepted it. A few of Karen's loyalists lingered, whispered, posted vague Facebook statuses, gave Sarah cold stares at neighborhood events. She ignored them. Karen didn't. She escalated. Late one night, flyers were slipped under several doors, anonymous, fear-mongering, claiming Sarah was running drills, encouraging people to report their tactically dressed neighbors. It was ridiculous, desperate. But someone actually called the police. The responding officer recognized Sarah. She'd trained him just 2 months earlier. He knocked on our door, embarrassed, and said, "Chief, we're required to respond." Sarah thanked him, then filed her own report. She wasn't ignoring Karen anymore. She was documenting her, because the real reckoning hadn't landed yet. But it was coming, and when it hit, it wouldn't just silence Karen, it would finally set the whole neighborhood free. Some people break under pressure. Karen? She doubled down, and it cost her everything. 2 days after the neighborhood woke up to those fear-stoking flyers, the city's legal team delivered their verdict. The HOA's financial records, once buried in generic expense codes and doctored spreadsheets, had finally been decoded, and what they uncovered made everything that had come before look tame. Over $75,000 in unaccounted funds, labeled innocuously security enhancements, community surveillance, emergency planning. But the reality? A paper trail of paranoia and self-interest, disguised as public safety. The so-called security contractor Karen hired didn't even exist in state licensing databases. No permit, no insurance, no staff, no physical address. It was a shell, a ghost firm, likely a front. Possibly just a friend with a fake invoice and a handshake deal. Karen had created her own little shadow government, and the deeper they dug, the more twisted it became. The city subpoenaed Karen's HOA-issued laptop, the one she was supposed to have turned in after her removal. But the serial number didn't match. She'd handed in a decoy. The real one, still in her possession. And it led to the smoking gun. Inside its hard drive was a folder labeled Neighborhood Integrity Protocols. It sounded harmless. It wasn't. Inside were detailed files on residents, notes, personal information, photos, HOA fine records linked directly to personal vendettas, even a spreadsheet labeled Priority Control Targets. There were names, addresses, notes like excessive laughter, frequent eye contact, suspected fence violation, and it got worse. One document titled Emerging Threats listed 3 neighborhood teenage boys who liked to skateboard near the clubhouse. It described them as high-mobility youth units with low respect for authority. Sarah read that line twice, and her jaw clenched, because it wasn't just bizarre. It was dangerous. Karen hadn't just tried to micromanage a neighborhood, she'd turned it into a psychological battleground, with herself as the lone general. The city convened an emergency meeting. Sarah was called in to review the evidence personally. She didn't say much as the documents were laid out across the conference table. But I watched her hands. Still. Silent. Controlled. Until one paper showed. A surveillance drone invoice, and her own name typed next to the words, "Observe and deter." That was the last straw. The city filed charges, fraud, misuse of public funds, illegal surveillance, falsifying documents. Karen Franklin, former queen of the cul-de-sac, was now officially under criminal investigation. And still, she didn't stop. Instead of hiding or apologizing or even remaining silent, Karen decided it was time to talk. She reached out to a fringe local podcast host, someone known for conspiracy theories and alternative truths, and she sat down for a tell-all interview. She called herself a whistleblower, claimed Sarah was part of a deep state operation to militarize the suburbs, said the city, the courts, and the HOA were all part of a coordinated takedown to silence brave citizens. The host nodded like it was gospel, asked questions like, Do you think this was planned from the beginning? And are there more like her infiltrating other HOAs? Karen ate it up. She rambled about drone surveillance, mail tampering, and something about electromagnetic fences. But what she didn't know was that the podcast's technical editor had once been mentored by Sarah during a police youth outreach program. When he saw her name on the guest list, he flagged it, and when he saw the raw footage, unedited, he passed it straight to Sarah's precinct. In that footage, Karen didn't just lie, she admitted on tape to falsifying HOA complaints. She described a plan to strategically reduce her influence by making her presence intolerable. She called Sarah a threat to manageable order, and she encouraged listeners to start their own control plans before it's too late. The district attorney didn't even hesitate. Within 48 hours, Karen was back in court, this time not as a plaintiff in a civil lawsuit, but as a defendant facing multiple felony counts. Her lawyer, the same sweaty, billboard-famous face from her last stunt, looked like he hadn't slept in days. He tried to pivot, downplay, deflect. But then Sarah's legal team brought the final hammer down. They submitted screenshots of a private HOA group chat, created and moderated by Karen, called Preserving Community Values. In those messages, she referred to Sarah by name, mocked her, suggested that we can't let her badge protect her, she has to go. One message even referenced a long-term extraction plan. The judge paused, then peered over his glasses and asked, "Miss Franklin, are you aware that knowingly filing a false defamation suit is itself grounds for prosecution?" Karen stammered, tried to mumble something about free speech. The courtroom chuckled. Her lawyer asked for a recess. They never filed a continuation. The lawsuit was dismissed by the end of the week, but Karen's downward spiral wasn't done. She began showing up to community events uninvited, hovering around the edges like a specter in sandals and sunglasses, pacing like she was looking for a stage that didn't exist. At one town-sponsored barbecue in the park, she pulled out a megaphone, no warning, and began ranting. Police corruption, HOA infiltration, drone surveillance on children, parents. Pulled their kids close. Sarah watched silently from across the park. She didn't move, didn't engage. Eventually, a city marshal stepped forward. "Ma'am, you're disrupting a public event. We'll have to ask you to leave." Karen shrieked about her First Amendment rights. What she didn't know was that the park had been officially reserved. Her rant wasn't protected speech. It was unlawful disruption. She was escorted off the property. Someone caught the whole thing on camera and posted it to the neighborhood group chat with the caption, "Karen's Greatest Hits, Volume 3. Most laughed. Sarah didn't. She wasn't amused, because she knew what desperation looked like, and Karen wasn't done flailing yet. That week, Sarah began receiving strange emails. No names, no return addresses, some vaguely threatening, some just strange. One accused her of orchestrating a neighborhood coup. Another said she was under divine judgment. One quoted scripture and warned of impending civic ruin. Sarah traced the IP addresses. Most came from public Wi-Fi, sources, libraries, cafes, gas stations, but one email slipped up. It included a signature block, automatically generated, from a man who used to date Karen. He had also served as her HOA treasurer. That was enough. Sarah filed for a restraining order. It was granted within 48 hours. But Karen's unraveling wasn't just emotional anymore. It was financial. Her house, once the most manicured on the block, now had overgrown weeds. Her SUV disappeared from the driveway, lights off for days, and then it happened. A small, official-looking envelope arrived from Karen's legal representative. Not a threat. Not a summons. It was a notice of asset liquidation. Karen had been forced to sell her home, her vehicle, and several personal items to pay. Restitution for the misused HOA funds. Attached was an inventory list. Most of it was mundane, but the final item stood out. A surveillance drone, label, damaged. Underneath, in handwriting, for Chief Bennett, with regret. No signature, but it didn't need one. Sarah held the letter quietly, read it once, then folded it and dropped the drone into a community tech recycling bin the next day. No victory. Lap, no gloating. She didn't want to keep a souvenir of that chapter. She just wanted it gone. And the next morning she laced up her shoes, holstered her sidearm, and went for her usual jog. Same route. Same calm stride. Only now every wave from a neighbor wasn't just friendly, it was respectful. Some clapped, one saluted. Sarah never asked to be a symbol, but she had become one anyway. And Karen? Karen was gone, not just from the block, but from the grip she once had on it. When a tyrant falls, they don't disappear. They echo. And sometimes that echo still tries to scream. With Karen gone, something unexpected happened. Not noise, not conflict, not chaos. Silence, but not the kind that unnerves you. This silence felt earned, like a long-held breath finally released. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt normal. Porch lights flickered on without fear of surveillance. Kids rode scooters down the sidewalks without parents peeking out every 30 seconds. Lawns grew a little imperfect, and nobody cared. It wasn't just peace. It was relief. Sarah, ever quiet, didn't bask in it. She just kept walking the same morning route, same hoodie, same steady pace, same holstered sidearm. But now, people didn't avoid eye contact. They waved, smiled, nodded in respect. Some even thanked her. One elderly man whispered, "Never seen a war won with patience before," because that's what it had been, a war. Fought not with fists, but with records, with laws, with composure. And Sarah had never raised her voice once. The new interim HOA board acted fast. They issued a public apology to every resident. Suspended all outstanding citations Karen had issued. And they launched a formal community review council, open to any resident who wanted to help rewrite the HOA bylaws from scratch. Karen's regime hadn't just collapsed. It had been wiped clean. And Sarah? She didn't take charge. She didn't nominate herself. She didn't even attend most of the meetings. She worked quietly, advising the board, helping where needed, but always from behind the curtain. Because for her, this had never been about power. It was about setting things right and keeping them that way. And yet, the silence didn't last. Just as the block settled into a steady rhythm again, something arrived. A white envelope. No return address, hand-delivered to City Hall, addressed to the mayor. Inside, doctored photos of Sarah, crude Photoshop jobs, one placing her inside a biker bar, another showing her allegedly spray-painting a public building, and the most ridiculous of all, a blurry image with her face clumsily superimposed on a masked protester holding a Molotov cocktail. But it wasn't the fakes that hit hard. It was the intent. Someone was still trying to destroy her, still trying to manipulate the narrative. Sarah didn't panic. She was tired. but not afraid. She turned everything over to digital forensics and internal affairs. The files were traced almost immediately to a laptop, the original HOA laptop, the one Karen claimed was lost during the leadership transition. But this wasn't the one she turned in. The serial number confirmed it. She had kept the real device and submitted a decoy. That alone would have been enough to reopen charges. But what they found next, that changed everything. The laptop contained cached files, emails, and folder backups. One led them to a storage unit under Karen's name. She had stopped payments recently, probably due to her frozen accounts, so the facility had flagged it for auction. The city got a warrant just in time. Inside, a mountain of boxes stacked from floor to ceiling, labeled HOA supplies, but filled with surveillance equipment, unopened packages of gardening tools meant for community projects, and something else, a row of drones, 4 of them, still in packaging, labeled Neighborhood Safety Patrol, files, fines, HOA checks, even a spreadsheet labeled Behavioral Monitoring. Every row a resident, notes like, talks too much to newcomers. Lawn too colorful? Complains about mail delays. Possible agitator. Sarah stared at the papers in silence as the evidence was documented. She didn't flinch, but I knew what was racing through her mind, because this wasn't petty anymore. It was systemic. Karen had tried to build a full-scale control system, backed by paranoia, funded by resident dues, protected by titles, and justified by fear. One file, labeled Incident Preparation Manual, outlined fake scenarios Karen planned to stage to justify new HOA rules, including a plan to bait Sarah into a confrontation. Another described manipulating residents with guilt-prone personalities to spread rumors. It was surreal, absurd, but also deeply dangerous. The city council convened immediately. Karen was charged with multiple counts: fraud, document falsification, illegal surveillance, theft of property, and misuse of municipal funds. The charges were serious enough to trigger something no one expected: a federal investigation into homeowner association abuses across the state. Karen's collapse had turned into a case study. Reporters camped outside City Hall. News vans circled the neighborhood. Journalists knocked on doors, whispering the same phrase. "Is this the block where the HOA president called the cops on the police chief?" Sarah stayed calm through it all, until Karen did what Karen always did. She found another camera. A fringe podcast host, already laughed off mainstream platforms, offered Karen a spot on his, show. She jumped at the chance. In that rambling, barely coherent interview, Karen called herself a warrior for property sanity. Claimed Sarah was an agent of a neighborhood reset agenda. Said her arrest was political revenge for knowing too much. What she didn't know was that the editor of that podcast, a former mentee of Sarah's law enforcement outreach program, and he had full access to the raw footage. In it, Karen ranted unscripted, unhinged, admitted she'd used fear to manage compliance, boasted she could spin any story, said Sarah needed to fall, or others might think they could lead too. The editor turned the footage over to the DA. That was the final straw. Karen was officially charged as a danger to public welfare, but even as her world collapsed, she tried one more time. She filed a lawsuit, again, claimed the city had violated her civil rights, that Sarah had orchestrated the investigation to ruin her. The judge didn't even entertain it. "Miss Franklin," he said, "you've mistaken consequences for conspiracy." The case was dismissed, before it could go to trial. Sarah received a letter that day from the district attorney's office. Karen had accepted a plea deal in exchange for full cooperation, testifying against other HOA officials she had mentored. She would serve a reduced sentence, but she would also be banned from holding any public, elected, or civic role for life. Her name was entered into the state's registry of disqualified civic actors, alongside those convicted of election fraud and corruption, legally exiled from the very systems she once weaponized. And Sarah, she didn't cheer. She didn't post about it. She simply nodded, then opened her laptop and submitted an internal proposal, a program for law enforcement officers on recognizing HOA harassment, identifying civil abuse patterns, and protecting community trust. It was approved in less than a week. Her story had spread far beyond our street. It became the spark for a state-level bill requiring HOA audits and community oversight. One senator referred to it as the Bennett Clause. But Sarah never took credit. She just kept doing her job. One morning, the new HOA board asked her to cut the ribbon on the remodeled clubhouse, the same one Karen used to summon residents for scoldings. Now, it had been turned into a community. Legal Resource Center, free workshops, civil rights pamphlets, HOA accountability guides. Sarah declined the ribbon. She just showed up quietly, stood in the back, and smiled. That day, a teenager approached her. He had once been fined for skateboarding near the mailbox cluster. He handed her a small thank you card. Inside it said, "Thanks for proving one person can make a difference, even when the whole world's waiting for them to screw up." She didn't say much, just gave him a high five, and walked back into the sun, same as always. Rebuilding doesn't start with noise. It starts with trust. And that trust was finally returning, one neighbor at a time. With Karen legally barred from every leadership role she once clung to like a crown, the neighborhood didn't just breathe easier. It began to breathe together. It wasn't instant. There was no grand ceremony, no collective sigh, just little things, barefoot kids laughing down sidewalks, chalk drawings reappearing on driveways, families barbecuing without peeking through blinds to check for Karen's flyers. For the first time in years, the HOA bulletin board held real information, garden clubs, yard sales, block parties. No veiled threats, no mandatory appearance fines, no citations about decorative excess. The new leadership didn't just manage. They listened. They walked the neighborhood and asked questions. What needs fixing? What needs protecting? What needs to never happen again? And in the middle of it all, Sarah remained Sarah. Not a queen, not a crusader, just a neighbor in joggers and a holstered sidearm, walking the same path every morning, waving to the same faces, though now those faces waved back with something deeper than politeness. Respect. But not everyone let go of Karen's ghost. A small, bitter faction clung to her memory like a life raft. They whispered in group chats, left cryptic comments on Facebook, said things like, "Sarah overstepped," or "You don't win by taking down a woman." They conveniently ignored the surveillance, the forged documents, the drone fleet, and the spreadsheet titled Sedition Watch List. And still, Sarah said nothing, because she understood something most people don't. You don't dismantle a lie by shouting louder. You do it by standing still until the truth rises louder than any scream. Then came the flyers. Again, slipped, under doors. Anonymous.crude. This time, the language was nastier. It labeled Sarah a rogue officer, claimed the HOA was now being run by a secret police alliance, even suggested that residents report suspicious activity like officers, jogging, military posture, and visible law enforcement gear. It was laughable, paranoid. But one neighbor, new to the area, took it seriously. He saw Sarah unloading groceries from her trunk in workout clothes with her badge clipped under her hoodie. He called the non-emergency line to report tactical activity. The officer dispatched that afternoon? He recognized Sarah instantly. She'd taught his de-escalation seminar during his academy training. He knocked on our door, awkwardly shifting his weight. "Chief, I'm required to follow up. But just between us, this is a waste of a shift." Sarah nodded, thanked him, and filed a quiet report. Not just on the call, but on the flyer. Because this wasn't fear anymore. It was obsession, and it wasn't over. The city's legal team, still reviewing the evidence uncovered in Karen's storage unit, had found something else. A list of names, people from other communities, HOA presidents, board members, advisors. Karen had served as a consultant for at least 3 other neighborhoods. She had sent them policy templates, scripts, even stock newsletters filled with buzzwords like community restoration, moral order, and strategic neighbor engagement. The phrase restore and secure appeared across multiple drafts. The same phrase she'd used to justify calling the police on Sarah. Those neighborhoods were now under investigation. 2. One had already frozen its HOA operations. Another issued an emergency audit and recalled their president. Karen hadn't just been a storm here. She was a model of storm, replicated elsewhere. That's when the district attorney's office reached out again. Karen, under pressure and with mounting evidence, had accepted a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing. She would testify against every board she advised. She would turn over every document, every email, every draft, and in return, she would never hold any civic, HOA, municipal, or public advisory role again. For life, legally blacklisted, branded untrustworthy by the state. Her name entered into a registry once reserved for people who had committed election fraud or embezzlement. It was over. Not just here, but everywhere she had once planted her flag. The morning we received that update, Sarah read the email and said nothing for a full minute. Then, with a quiet nod, she whispered, "Closure. Not justice, but close enough," and she went for her jog, same route, same rhythm. Only now, something new had begun to bloom. The HOA's new transparency policy went live, fully public online. Every meeting, every vote, every dollar. Residents could now see in real time what decisions were being made and by whom. And instead of fear, there was curiosity. People attended meetings, not to argue but to help, not to protest but to participate. They asked questions, suggested ideas, offered support. Someone proposed a community herb garden. Someone else suggested converting Karen's old compliance center into a resource library. It was approved unanimously, and when the doors finally opened, that once windowless room, where Karen had issued fines like royalty issuing decrees, was now filled with shelves, free HOA law guides, books on conflict resolution, printouts on renter rights, civil protection resources, and community de-escalation training. It was no longer a place of punishment. It was a place of protection. The new board invited Sarah to cut the ribbon. She declined. She said, I'll show up, but I don't need to hold the scissors. And she did. Quietly. In the back. She stood with a paper cup of lemonade and smiled as kids ran through the halls and neighbors laughed for the first time without tension. During that event, a teenage girl approached her, the same girl Karen had, once fined for hosting a lemonade stand without HOA permit. She handed Sarah a thank you card. Inside, a single line. "You changed everything, and you never once yelled." Sarah just gave her a gentle nod and whispered, "You're allowed." To be loud, I just wasn't. And that was it. No speeches. No spotlight. Just that one small human moment. That was always her way. But something even larger was taking shape. The mayor's office quietly reached out. The state was considering legislation, tentatively called the Community Oversight and Transparency Act, inspired by Sarah's case. It would require all HOAs to submit annual budgets to City Records Record and publish board meetings, offer open appeals for citations, and verify all emergency reports before acting on them. One senator even joked during a committee meeting, "If Karen Franklin hadn't called the cops on the police chief, we might still be blind to what some of these HOAs are doing." Sarah didn't celebrate. She didn't attend the hearings. She just kept walking, kept showing up to work, kept mentoring new officers, kept being the calm center of a storm that had finally passed. And yet, something still lingered. Not fear, not trauma, not Karen, but the memory of what happens when power grows unchecked. When silence becomes compliance, when fear becomes policy. Sarah hadn't just survived it, she'd redirected it. And slowly, the neighborhood was learning to do the same. When the fire goes out, it leaves behind ashes. But sometimes, it also leaves roots. The storm that had haunted our block was over, but every storm leaves cleanup. The lawns were greener. The meetings were peaceful. Kids painted chalk murals near the park again, quoting kindness, courage, and fairness. But for Sarah, peace didn't come as easily as it did for everyone else. Because while the neighborhood healed, she was still sorting through the debris Karen left behind. Emails, public, records, meeting transcripts, legal filings. It was all over, legally speaking, but something inside her still watched the horizon, not in fear, but in readiness. She didn't trust storms to stay gone, and she was right, because just when we thought Karen had vanished for good, another envelope arrived. This one wasn't anonymous. It came from Karen's legal representative. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a notice of asset liquidation. Karen had been forced to sell everything, her house, her SUV, even personal electronics, to pay back what she'd stolen from the HOA in the city. The document listed every item. One entry stood out, damaged surveillance drone, labeled for Chief Bennett, with regret. There was no signature. But we both knew who it was from. Sarah stared at the sheet for a long time, then folded it. Later that week, she dropped the drone into a donation box during a tech recycling. Drive. Quiet. Simple. No comment. She didn't want to keep a souvenir. She wanted to move on. The community, meanwhile, was doing more than moving on. It was growing. With the new board's transparency platform now live, every decision was voted on in the open. People started suggesting improvements instead of fearing enforcement. Sarah never took the microphone, but her fingerprints were everywhere. On training materials for conflict resolution, on HOA rule simplification drafts, even on the new signage. at the park that read, "This space belongs to all of us. Speak up, step forward, be heard." She had become the voice that didn't need to speak to lead. The Community Resource Center held its first workshop on HOA accountability and homeowners' rights. Nearly 30 people showed up, among them a man who had once been fined by Karen for putting his recycling bin out too early. He stood up during the Q&A and said, "I used to think people like me didn't matter, that if you didn't fight back with volume, you were invisible. Then I saw Sarah, and I realized quiet isn't weak. Sometimes it's what wins." That became the unofficial quote on everyone's lips. Quiet is what wins. Sarah never heard that phrase without shaking her head and chuckling softly. She didn't want to be quoted. She just wanted peace. But even in peace, Karen's ghost left echoes. One day, while we were drinking coffee on the porch, a city staffer arrived with a courier envelope. Inside was something that took Sarah's breath away, though not for the reasons you'd expect. It was the final audit report. Karen hadn't just mismanaged funds or fabricated enforcement. She had left behind a digital archive, hundreds of documents, some dating back years, showing a campaign of psychological manipulation across 3 other neighborhoods. The phrases pattern of non-compliance, sustained dissent suppression, and targeted isolation protocol appeared dozens of times. In one document, Karen had described a family, a couple with a disabled child, as frequent visual nonconformists. She had fined them into silence. Another file had tracked a veteran neighbor's activity, labeling him potential disruptor due to personal trauma history. It wasn't just petty tyranny, it was calculated profiling. Sarah read the reports in silence. Then she did something I hadn't seen her do through this entire battle. She cried. Just a few quiet tears. No sobbing. Just a slow exhale and a blink too heavy to hold back. Because it was never about just her. It was about everyone Karen had broken, bullied, and buried in silence. That night, Sarah made a decision. She called the city. She offered to lead a training session for HOA boards across the region, not about law enforcement, not about punishment, but about prevention, how to spot red flags, how to listen to residents, how to protect fairness, not enforce fear. The city accepted immediately. Her session was streamed, viewed by hundreds of HOAs statewide. Her core message: power doesn't go bad all at once. It spoils in small silences. You want to protect your neighborhood? Protect its voice. She didn't name Karen once, but everyone knew what and who she meant. The media picked up the session. The state senator who drafted the HOA reform bill mentioned her by name in his next speech. He said, "Sometimes reform doesn't come from the podium. It comes from the porch." And in our case, it had. But Karen's story still had one more twist. Because a few weeks later, on the 1-year anniversary of the 911 call that started it all, the neighborhood hosted a quiet celebration. No speeches, no banners, just food, music, families reconnecting. Someone played a rock ballad that had become an unofficial anthem during the recovery, a song about standing up, pushing through, and choosing the long road instead of the easy win. As the sun set, I looked at Sarah. She wasn't watching the crowd. She was watching the sky. Then she said something I'll never forget. The best part isn't that she lost. It's that we all won something back. Each other. That was Sarah. Always choosing the bigger truth over the smaller revenge. And just as we started walking home, another surprise arrived. Not from the city, not from the mayor, not from the courts. but from a teenager. The same boy Karen had once called a high-mobility youth unit for skateboarding too close to the clubhouse. He skated up awkwardly, held out a thank-you card, and muttered, "I'm not good at speeches or whatever, but you're cool. You didn't treat me like a threat. Just, thanks." Inside the card was a hand-drawn badge made of construction paper. It said, "Chief of the Block." Sarah laughed for real then. Not a chuckle, not a smirk, but the kind of laugh that comes only when the air is light again. She gave the kid a high five, told him to stay safe, and let him roll off into the sunset like some suburban superhero on four wheels. That night, as we sat on the porch, sipping coffee again, the air was still. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean, and Sarah, steady, watchful, quiet Sarah, looked out over the houses that once held so much tension and whispered, "This is what winning really feels like. No applause, no trophy, just peace." And in the absence of fear, something new had taken root. Not just order, but community. Sometimes justice looks like a courtroom, but the real kind? It looks like a neighborhood where kids feel safe again. Weeks passed. Laughter echoed on the sidewalks again. Porch lights glowed in the evenings like beacons of calm. The HOA meetings, once battlegrounds, had become boring. Gloriously, wonderfully boring. Budget updates, tool shed repairs, neighborhood BBQ sign-ups. Nobody shouted, nobody whispered about fines, nobody feared the next flyer sliding under their door. The Karen era was over, not just legally, emotionally, socially, spiritually, and yet, Sarah never treated it like a victory. She treated it like a responsibility. She didn't strut. She didn't boast. She didn't give interviews, though they kept asking. She just kept walking her same morning route. Same hoodie, same quiet strength. And the neighborhood followed her example, not with salutes, but with small acts of courage. One neighbor started a weekly art night for local teens. Another turned their garage into a free pantry with extra garden, produce, and basic supplies. The new HOA president, a soft-spoken former librarian, began holding coffee hours on Saturday mornings. No agenda. Just neighbors talking. Everything Karen had tried to control now blossomed without her. And still, her story wasn't quite finished. Because soon after her plea deal made headlines, the city council released a public statement, confirming something many had only guessed. Karen had not only advised 3 other HOAs, she had helped design enforcement manuals that were quietly adopted in 7 neighborhoods across the state. Each manual used the same euphemisms: compliance culture, behavior mapping, civic watch principles. The documents were identical in tone: authoritarian, invasive, deeply manipulative. And all of them could be traced back to Karen's original drafts. The fallout was immediate. City attorneys opened audits on every HOA she had touched. One board president resigned overnight. 2 neighborhoods suspended all citations pending legal. Review 1 even posted a banner in front of their clubhouse: "We stand with Bennett." Fear is not leadership. Sarah saw the photo of that banner online. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh. She just whispered, "It's not about me." But we both knew it was. Not because she asked for it, because she earned it. Because while Karen had tried to rule with fear and fiction, Sarah had stood up with facts, documentation, and unshakable calm. And that had rippled further than anyone expected. One morning, the state governor's office contacted her department. A new task force was forming, focused on abuse in quasi-governmental community structures, HOAs, neighborhood boards, local councils. They wanted Sarah's input. She declined. Not out of fear or defiance, but because she believed the community was always the first line of defense. Her mission wasn't power, it was prevention. Instead, she offered to build a free training module, open, to any HOA leader or resident statewide, no cost. No mandatory registration, just tools. She titled it simply, The Silence That Breaks Us, Recognizing Abuse in Civic Systems. It became the most downloaded community protection module in the state's portal. But while the world listened, Karen disappeared. Her house had long been sold. Her social media deleted. She vanished from HOA databases like she'd never existed. Some said she moved out of state. Others claimed she was still lurking, rebranding, planning something somewhere else. But Sarah didn't waste time speculating. She knew what mattered wasn't where Karen went. It was what Karen had done and what it had taught the rest of them. That unchecked power will always find a way to grow, unless someone's willing to quietly stop it. And then something strange happened. One afternoon, Sarah received a plain white envelope. No name, no return address, hand-delivered by courier. Inside, a single sheet of paper, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were just a few sentences. I didn't realize how far I was going. I felt threatened by your calm. You made me feel invisible, and I confused that with being unsafe. That's not an excuse. But it's all I have. It wasn't signed. But it didn't need to be. Sarah stared at it for a long time. Didn't tear it up. Didn't frame it. Didn't even react. She just folded it once and slid it into the back of her journal. Not as a trophy, as a record, not of guilt, but of why vigilance still matters. Because Karen hadn't started evil. She'd started unquestioned, and Sarah had stopped. Her, not by overpowering her, but by outlasting her. A few weeks later, Sarah was invited to speak at a statewide leadership panel. She declined the keynote spot and asked to participate only if she could sit in the crowd, listen, and answer questions from the back of the room. They agreed. During the session, someone asked her, "What does real leadership look like in communities? Like yours?" Sarah didn't blink. She just said, "It looks like refusing to speak when you're angry and insisting on speaking when others are afraid." The room went silent. One woman whispered, "I wish we had someone like you on our board." Sarah replied softly, "You don't need someone like me. You need to trust the quiet ones who've already been watching." That quote became the closing slide of the session. But back home, Sarah stayed grounded. She walked her morning route, greeted neighbors, shared advice with new board members, and helped train young officers on how to recognize the difference between order and oppression. Because there's a difference. A big one. And Karen had blurred that line for far too long. But not anymore. Not here. One day, during a late summer block event, a group of neighborhood kids asked if they could paint a mural on the clubhouse wall. The new board approved it instantly. What they painted wasn't flashy, it wasn't political. It showed a woman in a hoodie walking down a suburban street, waving gently to neighbors. Her face wasn't detailed, just calm, focused, peaceful. Above her they painted 5 simple words, because one person stood first. Sarah saw it the next morning on her jog. She stopped for a moment, took it in, then turned, waved at a passing neighbor, and continued on her route without a word. Because she knew the truth. It was never about stopping Karen. It was about protecting the space she tried to steal, the space for dignity, for peace, for people who just want to live without fear of fines, for how they decorate their porch or who they talk to. And now, that space was real, alive, and guarded by more than law. It was guarded by memory. Some victories happen with applause, but the most powerful ones? They happen in silence, when no one's looking. It had been a year, one full year since Karen stood on the curb in her robe, clutching her phone like a weapon, dialing 911 on the new chief of police over a legally holstered sidearm. 1 year since the neighborhood lived in the shadow of HOA newsletters, backdoor fines, secret watch lists, and threats disguised as policy. Now, the only thing left of that past was memory. And Sarah? She didn't mark the anniversary with speeches or posts or interviews. She marked it by doing what she always did, jogging, hoodie, badge at her waist, calm eyes. Except now, people didn't just wave. They walked alongside her. Neighbors who had once been quiet now met her pace. Teens who once feared authority now gave her fist bumps. Kids who used to get fined for skateboarding now practiced tricks in the street with chalk lanes drawn like a racetrack. It wasn't just change, it was trust, rebuilt one quiet act at a time. That trust had spread far beyond the neighborhood. The HOA reform bill that began as a conversation around our community center had passed into law. Unanimously, every HOA in the state was now required to submit audited budgets, publish board votes, and open enforcement decisions to community appeal. A line in the bill's introduction read, "No rule should exist without the people's ability to understand it, question it, and change it when necessary." They called it the Bennett Principle. Sarah never asked for her name to be used, but she didn't stop it either, because she knew this was bigger than her. And yet, despite all the change, all the growth, all the reform, something still lingered. Not tension, not fear, but watchfulness. Because even after a reckoning, echoes remain. Karen may have been exiled, disgraced, and legally barred from ever leading again. But Sarah never forgot the deeper truth. Power doesn't always start evil. It goes bad when no one checks it, and that's why she stayed. Not to rule, not to gloat, to watch, to listen, to ensure no one ever had to go through what she did. Not in this neighborhood, and not anywhere else. The Community Resource Center now held quarterly forums, no longer called HOA meetings. They were just neighbor gatherings, open mic, no fines, no fear, just people on talking. One night, they held a film screening of a documentary on community abuse of power. Afterward, someone asked Sarah to speak. She walked up to the front slowly, not eager, not reluctant. And in the softest voice in the room, she said, "The job of a community isn't to follow the loudest voice. It's to protect the quietest one." That line was printed onto the community's next mural, but Sarah didn't pose. Next to it, she didn't even attend the dedication event. She just sent a small card that read, "Thank you for remembering what matters." Then came the letter. Another one. Plain white envelope. Official city seal. No return address. It was from the district attorney's office. Karen had fulfilled the terms of her plea deal. She had testified. She had turned over everything. And she had agreed, in writing, on record, to forfeit every right to hold office, participate in public decision-making, or serve on any neighborhood advisory council in the state. She would no longer appear in public records related to governance. Her name was removed from committee rosters, planning minutes, and advisory boards, legally erased from the civic landscape she once tried to control. But there was more. The letter contained an inventory, assets seized and sold for restitution, her house, her car, her tech, even her HOA-branded stationery, and at the bottom of the page, one last item, drone, label, damaged, note for Chief Bennett, with regret. There was no signature, but again, it didn't need one. Sarah read it, set it down, then picked it up and walked outside to the community recycling drive. She didn't donate it to a museum. She didn't keep it as proof. She dropped it into the bin, turned, walked away, and never looked back. Because souvenirs belonged to tourists, and Sarah, she had lived this. The next morning, a quiet knock came at our door. It was a teenager, the same one Karen had once flagged in her secret spreadsheet as a high-mobility youth with low HOA respect. He wore headphones, skateboard under his arm, nervous grin on his face. I wanted to give you this, he said, handing Sarah a hand-folded paper star. Inside, in jagged handwriting, it read, "Thanks for letting us be loud again." Sarah didn't cry, but she blinked slower than usual and just said, "Keep being loud, just point it in the right direction." He nodded and skated away, and then the final scene. One afternoon, the new HOA board asked Sarah to attend the dedication of a small plaque outside the community center. It wasn't about her, not directly. It was about the transformation. They had renamed the building, once known as the Civic Enforcement Office, to something new. The Bennett Center for Neighborhood Trust. Sarah froze when she saw it. She turned to me and whispered, "I didn't want a name on a building." I smiled and said, "You didn't get a name, you got a neighborhood." And she nodded, just once, and stepped inside. That evening, we sat on our porch again. Same view, same breeze, but a different silence, a full silence. The kind that only arrives when a long chapter has finally ended. The sun dipped behind the rooftops. Kids laughed in the distance. Someone played music from a back patio, not loud enough to disturb, just loud enough to belong. Sarah sipped her coffee. No words, just presence. Then she looked over at me and said, "Power doesn't have to destroy people. But if no one challenges it, it always will." I didn't respond. Because what do you say to someone who just spent a year standing up for an entire community? With nothing but patience, principle, and a badge no one saw until it was too late? She didn't ask to be a hero. She just refused to be silent. And in the space where fear once ruled, something had bloomed. Fairness, connection, strength. And one woman's quiet stand became the reason we all now stood together.